Shalom, shalom, friends, and welcome to this episode here of the Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times. I apologize for the constant pushing back of this episode. It was a combination of things, including but not limited to me getting a little bit of a cold, as you can probably kind of hear now, and also having some previous debates and stuff like that I had already set up before this. And also just kind of having life get the better of me in certain instances. And so, unfortunately, this got pushed back all week. It currently says 5/12 because it was supposed to be aired on 5/12, right? But actually, of course, today is 5/14. So that'll have to be edited and all that. But nonetheless, do want to apologize for that. And also want to apologize, of course, for the brief pauses we have here in the beginning. Unfortunately, I only have the 30-second countdown at the moment. I want to get a longer countdown than that. I know that, like John Maddox, for example, has a 2-minute countdown on his apologetics channel, and I'm thinking of getting something along those lines because 30 seconds just isn't really enough, in my opinion. But nonetheless, just wanted to briefly apologize for those things. Welcome, friends. Welcome. Shalom. Happy to have you here today. The topic at hand today is not exactly fun, but of course, these topics never really are. So to a certain extent, I'm not really telling you guys anything new there. This is just the world that we live in, and we're getting closer and closer and closer to absolutely crazy events. And of course, that's what we're going to be talking about here today. I do have a pre-article discussion before we get into all of our different articles and things of that nature. So we're going to go ahead and discuss those things real briefly. And what I want to discuss today is actually the Caitlyn Jenner gubernatorial campaign that is apparently a thing now, right? So Caitlyn Jenner is going to be seeking the California Republican nomination for governor, right? And that election, of course, happens in 2022. But Caitlyn Jenner is announcing that he wants to run now today, of course, because you have to get your whole campaign and all that kind of stuff going. By today, I just mean in this day. I don't mean literally this very day, but nonetheless, and that's something that we now have, going on for us today. I wanted to talk about this because this is something that a lot of people have talked about already, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but at the same time, it is something that absolutely needs to be addressed because we are getting to a stage where the quote-unquote conservative side of things is just 100% willing to tell morality to kick rocks, to tell tradition to kick rocks, to tell sanity and rationality to kick rocks. And for the sake of votes, to go all in on things that just 10 years ago we would have thought completely absurd. Now, I don't mean to come up on here and trumpet a bunch of I told you so's, but also I literally told you so, right? Let's just be clear here. What's one of the things that I have been talking about since, if you know me personally, 2015, but if you're just familiar with these watchdogs since 2018, right? What is one of the things that I have been harping on? That because the right decided that they were going to get in bed with thrice divorced serial philanderer, accused rapist, beauty pageant hosting Donald Trump, right? And etc. I could add so much more, right? The fact that the right was going to get in bed with him was going to make everything worse on the moral end. And so far, both of the things which I specifically predicted about that have actually come to pass. I'm not saying I'm some clairvoyant or anything. I'm just saying people need to start paying attention to these details, right? What was the first thing that I had said? I had said we were going to get into a situation where somebody will show up who we have problems with. We have problems with their lifestyle. We have problems with their morality, the way that they keep themselves, all that kind of stuff, right? And the left is going to be able to throw back in our face, yeah, but what about Donald Trump? And lo and behold, that happened twice in the election cycle of 2020, once with Pete Buttigieg being a homosexual, and another time with Kamala Harris, who is, of course, now the vice president, being that she slept with a married man in order to get a position of power. We brought those things up, and what did the left respond with? Exactly what I told you they would respond with, because why wouldn't they? You presented them this opportunity on a silver platter with nice garnishes and all that other sort of stuff, right? They came back with, but what about Donald Trump? But what about Donald Trump? You guys basically worship this man. What about Donald Trump? And they're right, frankly. Why is it okay for Donald Trump to be thrice married and twice divorced and have accusations against him? And not just forget the rape accusations, right? What about the much more credible accusations of spousal abuse from his first marriage, right? Now, I'm not here to dog on Trump per se, but the point being that why is that okay for us to put forward as the quote unquote moral right, the moral majority, the religious right, whatever it is, right? We put that forward, but then we'll criticize Kamala Harris for sleeping with a married man 30 years ago in order to get a position of power. People say, okay, but Trump wasn't doing anything corrupt. Yeah, but also what Kamala did was 3 decades ago. What Trump did was in the 2010s, right? And I think like that's a huge deal for people, because here's what it sounds like, okay? And I'm a conservative, by the way, right? I'm not a liberal. In fact, I don't mean to brag, but I'm one of the more ideologically consistent conservatives, right? I'm very deeply constitutional, very deeply influenced by my Christian faith, so on and so forth, right? What it sounds like is all of those things are bad if you disagree with me politically. But if you agree with me politically, then all of those things are pedantic or irrelevant, right? In other words, you don't actually care about the morality, you care about the political ideology of the person in question. Now, if you do only care about the political ideology of the person in question, fine, but say as much. Don't pretend like you're the arbiter of some moral high ground. You're not. You're simply interested in getting your political views, your political ideology, in the offices that currently rule our nation. That's it. That's fine. I don't necessarily have a problem with that per se. However, don't pretend you're some moral majority and then support people like Caitlyn Jenner and Donald Trump. And by the way, that gets me to my second point. The second thing that happened, which I also explicitly predicted, is now the right is losing its standards. It is completely and totally losing its standards. It is no coincidence that less than a year after the Donald Trump presidency, we have a transgender person wanting to run for governor as a Republican. That is not a coincidence. And by the way, when Caitlyn Jenner inevitably wins the Republican nomination, because he will, that's not a coincidence either. Okay, this is something that was set up, not intentionally. I'm not saying that this was a conspiracy, right? But this is something that was set up by the 2015-2016 Trump campaign. This is something that was set up by us the conservatives, us the Christians, saying we don't care that this person did all of these things, even as recently as, in the case of, what was the Stormy Daniels thing, right? He paid Stormy Daniels off in 2016, right? That's while he's running for president, for crying out loud, right? And we got in bed with that willingly. We had Rand Pauls, we had Ben Carsons, we had Ted Cruz's, we had Daryl Castles. We got in bed with Donald Trump willingly. And now, because of that, we are in bed with Kamala Harris's and Caitlyn Jenner's and all that other kind of stuff. That is the way that worked. And again, I explicitly and specifically warned you guys about this. And I know a lot of you guys believed me because a lot of you guys are watching the show, right? But you can go back and watch. We were hammering on this over and 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 over again. You lose the moral high ground, and that means, number one, everybody's going to point it out. Well, what about Kamala Harris? Yeah, well, what about Donald Trump? And number two, you will not stop here. It will lead inevitably to Kid Rock's. You remember that when Kid Rock wanted to seek the senatorial position for Michigan? It will inevitably lead to, here we are with Caitlyn Jenner's, Kanye West's, right? These types of people who have no business being in politics, who have no business being supported by Christian conservatives, okay, end up being the people who we willingly choose to represent us, because it will not stop with the Donald. Okay. And this is why I always use the dam analogy. There is one dam that is protecting this city from the waves of sins and immorality, right? That dam, by the grace of God, has been conservatives. If you remove that dam, that one and only dam that is protecting the city, then there is, by definition, no longer a dam protecting the city, and the waters will flow. It's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. And we're currently in a position where we have now seen the waters flow. But that's my pre-article discussion. Let me know in the comment section what you think. Let's go ahead and move on to some of the articles we have for today, because they're juicy, I'll tell you. They are juicy. Sorry, just getting some coffee here and getting my screen shared. All right. So, first thing we'll be talking about, another pastor has been arrested for preaching the gospel. That's right, another pastor has been arrested for preaching the gospel. Once again in Canada. So we're now at quite a bit now, right? We got Tony Spell in Louisiana, John MacArthur in California, James Coates in Canada, Al Sherwood in Britain. This is, of course, another person in Canada. As you guys are going to see here, his name is very difficult to pronounce, so that's why I'm not saying it. Well, maybe not. Maybe I'm just terrible at pronouncing certain kinds of names, but nonetheless, you guys get the idea, right? Excuse me. We're actually having quite the uptake of pastors being arrested, whether it's for violating COVID rules or for preaching against homosexuality or preaching against transgenderism or something along those lines, right? Those tend to be the big three that are actually getting people arrested. But regardless of why, we are seeing a very large increase in arrests of pastors and religious officials in the West simply for preaching the gospel. And they hide it behind stuff. No, it's not preaching the gospel. It's because you're gathering preaching the gospel. And it's like, okay, obviously that doesn't make any sense, right? You're not just going to preach to a wall. Also, the Bible does clearly tell us that we are to gather. And so you're not allowed by virtue of the First Amendment of the Constitution to tell us we're not to gather. Also, freedom of assembly. But we'll get to that. The point being, we are seeing an increase now, again, of pastors being arrested for all of these reasons. And I think that it would be good for us to just be aware of this, really, right? To make sure that we are on top of every single time this happens and that we're speaking out about it and that we're not taking it, right? Now, obviously, I'm not saying that we need to react in any sort of a violent or revolutionary way. So don't get that idea, because that is not the idea, right? Excuse me. In fact, that's just a way to make everything worse. But absolutely, these people should be experiencing incredible resistance, right? I, for one, would advocate that if we are going to have situations where certain laws are being used against pastors, that we as the church should all collectively go out of our way to violate those laws. In other words, if we have COVID restrictions and pastors are being arrested because COVID restrictions actually come into conflict with their ability to preach the gospel to their congregation, then even churches who disagree should be congregating in protest. Say, you're going to use this against people to reduce our religious liberty. Well, you had one problem, now you have 12. Deal with it. Or stop arresting people. You can't fill up the jails with nothing but pastors. It ain't going to work, buddy. Right? And that's a very old, very useful technique, the technique of civil disobedience, right? Something that was, of course, popularized by Martin Luther King Jr. I think it's something that we as Christians would be wise to start using. But nonetheless, let's get into the article here. By the way, I do apologize if this episode has me a little foggy. I don't know if I sound foggy or not, but I feel foggy because I am still kind of sick. So if that is the case, I do apologize. Excuse me. Anyways, a Canadian pastor who went viral last month for ordering out police who showed up to his church on Easter weekend. Yeah, you remember that when he was telling them out, you guys need to get out, you need to get out, you need to get out. Obviously, very heroic thing to do, in my opinion, when it comes to these vicious tyrants. Tyrants that we really haven't seen in the West for quite some time. But nonetheless, A Canadian pastor who went viral last month for ordering out police who showed up to his church on Easter weekend was arrested Saturday for violating COVID-19 limits on gatherings set by a new court order. Pastor Artur Pawlowski, I think is how you say that, but I'm almost positive I said it wrong. The head of Calgary's Street Church in Alberta and his brother, Dawid Pawlowski, were arrested and charged with, quote, organizing an illegal in-person gathering, end quote, the Calgary Police Service said in a statement. Video capturing the arrest showed several police vehicles, parked on the streets as officers carried the handcuffed brothers who appeared to refuse to walk on their own, as I would as well. An onlooker can be heard telling the officers, quote, shame on you guys, this is not communist China. That is correct. It's actually communist Canada. Nonetheless, don't you have family and kids? Whatever happened to Canada, God keep our land glorious and free, end quote. I think that went out the door maybe like 100 years ago, but that's just me. Nonetheless, I appreciate the person having a problem with it and speaking up. The arrests come after Alberta Health Services on Thursday obtained a Court of Queen's bench order that applies to gatherings, including protests, demonstrations, and rallies. The order imposes new restrictions on organizers of protests and demonstrations, requiring compliance with public health orders, including masking, physical distancing, and attendance limits, according to police. Which, by the way, means this is a retroactive arrest, right? They're arresting him for something that happened on Easter, even though the law wasn't passed until... this is saying Thursday. I think what they mean by Thursday is last Thursday, because if I'm not mistaken, this was actually, I'm not seeing the date here, but I believe this was written on Friday of last week. But nonetheless, and so I think the Thursday that they're speaking of would probably be Thursday the 6th, but nonetheless. Pastor Artur Pawlowski, the head of Calgary, wait, let's see, I already read that. The arrest came after Alberta's Health Services on Thursday obtained, I already read that also. Sorry, I apologize. Calgary Police Service said officers served an organizer of the church service with the court order, quote, in an effort to ensure that citizens attending the Saturday service were abiding by the current COVID-19 public health orders, end quote. Quote, the order was served prior to the church service and the CPS did not enter the church during the service, end quote, the police agency said. Quote, the service organizer acknowledged the injunction, but chose to ignore requirements for social distancing, mask wearing, and reduced capacity limits for attendees, and continued with the event, end quote, which of course is his sovereign right. Last month, Artur Pawlowski was holding a service on Holy Saturday when several uniformed officers entered the building. In a video of the encounter shared to YouTube, the pastor can be heard shouting at the masked officers to leave. Quote, out of this property immediately until you come back with a warrant, end quote, he yelled. Quote, I don't want to talk to you. I don't care what you have to say. Get out of this property, Nazis. Gestapo is not allowed here, end quote. And by the way, I do very, very much recommend you watch that video because it was exactly the way that pastors should be responding to these thugs. The officers exited the building without incident. Pawlowski has regularly spoken at anti-mask rallies in Calgary and was fined last year for failing to adhere to COVID-19 restrictions earlier in the pandemic, CBC News reported. He told Fox News last month that he grew up in Poland behind the Iron Curtain, meaning that he was in communist Poland, controlled by the USSR, and equated increased government control in Canada over religious gatherings to what he experienced living under the Soviets, which is exactly accurate, of course. In its statement Saturday, Calgary police said, quote, it is important to understand law enforcement recognizes people's desire to participate in faith-based gatherings as well as the right to protest. However, notice that they put an asterisk because they don't actually find it important to understand these things. However, as we find ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic, we all must comply with public health orders in order to ensure everybody's safety and well-being, end quote. Wasn't it C.S. Lewis who famously said that there is no worse tyrant than the one who tyrannizes with with his own good conscience? I probably butchered that, but you get the idea what Lewis was saying, right? A tyrant who oppresses you, thinking that he is actually doing you good, is the very worst tyrant because his conscience tells him that it's all fine, it's all dandy, right? In fact, he's even in the right. You're the one in the wrong. And in fact, don't we see a perfect example of that in the man who has become ubiquitous with, who has become synonymous with evil namely Hitler, whose name has become synonymous with evil, right? Hitler believed that he was doing the right thing. He did. I mean, that's just the facts. Read Mein Kampf, read Nazi ideology, read the different things that he would say in his speeches and the different things that people supported him for. He absolutely thought he was on the right side. So did the German people. That's precisely one of the things that makes him so terrible. He's not sitting there, oh, I know I'm evil. He thinks he's doing good. He calls good evil and evil good, just as the prophet Isaiah said. And that is exactly what is occurring in these Western nations. It's not to the same extent. Don't get me wrong. Okay? I'm not saying that we're having people systematically executed to the tune of millions in Canada. Okay? That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is there is a precedent, there is a pattern, and it is all throughout history. It is ubiquitous and cross-cultural. And we are seeing that occur again in Canada, in France, in Denmark, in the United States, in Britain, in all of these different Western countries, in Israel even. Quote, we continue to ask those who may be considering organizing or participating in any outdoor events to ensure that they are familiar with public health order requirements and to do their part to prevent further spread of the virus, end quote. Another high-profile arrest in the region came Saturday as hundreds protested, outside the Whistle Stop Cafe in Mere, Alberta to support owner Chris Scott. Alberta Health Services said it shut down the restaurant Wednesday after receiving more than 400 complaints since January, the Calgary Herald reported. Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived at the Save Alberta Camp Out protest and began ticketing attendees, and Scott was taken into custody. Video of the arrest posted to the Whistle Shop's Facebook page showed officers patting down and handcuffing Scott before placing him in the back of a police vehicle. In response to the court order, the Alberta RCMP, which is the Royal Mounted Police, I believe, Crown's Mounted Police, something like that. Anyways, issued a statement Friday outlining a variety of ways to enforce the order, including, quote, the ability to issue tickets, fines, and criminal charges to individuals who are breaking public health orders by organizing and or attending these events, end quote. So if you organize or attend these events, you can be charged as a criminal. As a criminal. This is literally the world we're living in. This isn't 1984. This isn't right-wing propaganda. This isn't the Left Behind series. This is the beginning. In fact, it's not really the beginning because this has been going on for quite some time. It's just finally getting to a place where it's starting to become blatant, right? But this is the world that we are living in, and it's the world that we're going to live in very soon. Because believe me, coming soon to a city near you. In fact, depending on where you live, it might already be there. If you're living in California, if you're living in Louisiana, if you're living in New York, Illinois, it's already there. You already have pastors and rabbis and things of that nature being arrested for having the audacity to preach. Quote, this can include arrests and removal of any person who has notice of this order and chooses to act in violation of it, end quote, the RCMP said. Quote, law enforcement agencies can act immediately under this injunction without the necessity of Alberta Health Services attendance. Our primary role is and always will be keeping all Albertans safe while upholding the law, end quote. And there we have the end of the article. And just in case you thought that was enough, just in case you thought that maybe that's the only instance of egregious persecution of Christians occurring in the West, that will get worse because it never starts with stoning people in the middle of the street. It starts with this stuff, right? But nonetheless, school chaplain reported to anti-terrorism unit after sermon challenging LGBT ideology. Yes, the school chaplain was reported to the anti-terrorism unit for challenging LGBT ideology, which, as you're going to figure out as we read this article, isn't actually an accurate way to describe what he did. He simply said that he thought that it was wise for people to discuss these issues and to not buy the hog right out the gate. That's it. He was simply saying we should have debate. He was not endorsing one side over the other. And yet not only did they charge him, not only did they actually, or not charge him, report him to the anti-terrorism unit, and this is in Britain, but they fired him and now are slandering him by actually miscommunicating what he actually said. Which, by the way, I don't have a problem with him if he were to challenge LGBT ideology. I think he should. I think we all should, because it's incredibly dangerous. However, the point is, they're trying to make it worse in the eyes of the populace than it actually was because they want you to hate him. And don't get me wrong, the Christian Institute, who we're currently reading this from, is probably on the more sympathetic side of those things, but they're still falling into that trap. A school chaplain has taken legal action against a boarding school after he was reported to the government's anti-terrorism unit and sacked for delivering a sermon with which encouraged respect and debate on LGBT issues. And that is accurate. That's exactly what was said. It wasn't challenging anything, although I believe he should have. We just need to be accurate, though. He wasn't challenging anything. He was simply saying we should have the right to debate. We should discuss these matters. Reverend Dr. Bernard Randall is taking Trent College to court for discrimination, harassment, victimization, and unfair dismissal, supported by the Christian Legal Center. By the way, I hate to be cynical, but I just have to be honest. I think he's going to lose. I appreciate that he wants to attack these people, and I support him, and I will pray for him, and I suggest that you support and pray for him also. But I do think we also need to not, we shouldn't be expecting things that go in our favor in this day and age, right? Given all the things that have happened in the past, just in the past 6 months, let alone the past year, I really don't think it's wise to expect we get the right outcome out of this. But who knows? We got the right outcome out of some of the Tommy Robinson cases, right? So Britain's not completely a lost cause, I guess. Anyways, the chaplain was concerned when the independent school, which exists to educate children according to the Protestant and evangelical principles of the Church of England, adopted guidance promoting radical LGBT ideology. But when he preached that students are not compelled to accept this, school officials reported him to the Prevent program. Smash heteronormativity. In June 2018, the school invited Ellie Barnes, the leader of the LGBT activist group Educate and Celebrate, to give staff training on how they could, quote, embed gender identity, and sexual orientation, end quote, into the fabric of their school. Which, let me say very poignantly, any Christian school whatsoever, any Christian church, any Christian organization whatsoever that wants to embed gender identity, and sexual orientation into the fabric of their school, leave them. They are not believers. I don't mean to be so bold, but I feel like sometimes we got to be bold, right? And I've always been one who's kind of uncomfortable with saying that somebody, such and such a person, is not actually faithful. However, that is the most blatant rebellion against the Bible that we have seen thus far, outside of just becoming outright atheistic. So leave them, turn away. Let's get back to the article. During the session, staff were encouraged to chant, "Smash heteronormativity," which is just a way of saying normalcy. The view that heterosexuality is the norm. It is, by the way. Barnes also incorrectly stated that gender identity is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act and must be legally recognized by the school, which, as the article points out, it is not, nor should it be. But anyways, as Dr. Randall's job description states, he is to be, quote, the particular voice and embodiment of Christian values which are at the heart of Trent's ethos, end quote. He raised concerns and was told he would be involved in any decision-making process over whether the school would adopt Educate and Celebrate's gold standard program. But in January of 2019, he discovered the school was set to implement the LGBT inclusive curriculum from nursery upwards. From nursery upwards! Yes, you heard that correctly. When he asked why he had not been consulted, he was told he was omitted because he might disagree. Respect and tolerance. Later in the year, after asking students what subjects they would like to hear covered in future sermons, the chaplain was asked, quote, "How come we are told we have to accept all this LGBT stuff in a Christian school," end quote. And ain't that the question of the century? Dr. Randall responded in a subsequent sermon to students by saying that, quote, when ideologies compete, we should not descend into abuse. We should respect the beliefs of others, even when we disagree. Adding, no one should be told they must accept an ideology, love the person, even where you profoundly dislike the ideas, end quote. I want to go ahead and quote that one more time, because that is the exact phrase that has this man reported to the anti-terrorism unit in Britain. Let's read it again. This is terrorism, according to Britain, at least according to some people in Britain. When ideologies compete, we should not descend into abuse. We should respect the beliefs of others, even when we disagree. No one should be told they must accept an ideology, love the person, even where you profoundly dislike the ideas, end quote. That was reported to the anti-terrorism unit. Are you waking up, Christian? Are you waking up, conservative, libertarian, whatever you happen to be? Are you smelling the coffee? Or in this case, the rancid, rotting fish? Because if you're not smelling it now, I don't think you will. I got to be honest with you. He clearly stated that same-sex attracted people and those struggling with gender dysphoria should not be discriminated against, but they are made in the image of God, because they are made in the image of God, rather, but told students, quote, you do not have to accept the ideas and ideologies of LGBT activists, end quote, where they are in conflict with Christian values. However, the following week, he was interrogated by the deputy head and the school's designated safeguarding lead, who told him his beliefs were not relevant, had upset some students, and had undermined the school's LGBT agenda. He was immediately suspended pending an investigation. The next portion here is danger to children. Yes, this man's a danger to children. Following the meeting, Dr. Randall was reported to the counter-terrorism watchdog Prevent as a potentially violent extremist, and to the local authority designated officer Orlando as a danger to children. Let's repeat that one more time. Following the meeting, Dr. Randall was reported to the counter-terrorism watchdog Prevent as a potentially violent extremist, and to the local authority designated officer Lado as a danger to children. Why? Because he said you should have the right to debate. While the police officer who reviewed the Prevent report said the sermon posed no terror risk, he reportedly claimed the sermon was wholly inappropriate for a school and society in general. Yes, wholly inappropriate for society to be preaching the word of God. But whatever, that's fine, right? Who cares what this man has to say? Dr. Randall was dismissed in August 2019, but this was overturned on appeal by the governors. However, he was given a final warning and forced to agree to have his sermons vetted in advance, and that he would not say anything likely to cause offense or distress to members of the school body. In other words, not allowed to preach the gospel. The chaplain was furloughed. I don't think I said that right, but nonetheless, at the beginning of lockdown in March 2020, and when restrictions eased in, his full-time role was reduced to just 7 hours a week. He was eventually made redundant just after Christmas. Potential terrorist. Dr. Randall said he discovered he had been reported to Prevent. He was, when he had discovered he was reported to Prevent, he was terrified. Quote, I did not sleep. What was I supposed to tell my family? Being reported as a potential terrorist, extremist, and a danger to children are arguably the worst crimes you can be accused of. And of course, the accusation in and of itself, if it doesn't have any solid evidence behind it, becomes slander. Back to the quote, when I found out they had reported me without telling me, my mind was blown trying to comprehend it. I had gone to such lengths in the sermon to stress that we must respect one another no matter what, even people we disagree with. I am not ashamed that I cried with relief when I was told the report to Prevent was not going to be taken further. Yet I ended up being told that I had to support everybody else's beliefs no matter what, while my Christian beliefs, the Church of England's beliefs, were blatantly censored, end quote. He continued, quote, during the disciplinary hearing, I was never asked what I thought. They just assumed that I had extreme religious views. I don't think the Church of England is an extremist organization. I was doing the job I was employed to do. I wasn't saying anything that I should not have been able to say in any liberal secular institution. Everyone should be free to accept or reject an ideology. Isn't that what liberal democracy means? It seems it is no longer enough to just tolerate LGBT ideology. You must accept it without question, and no debate is allowed without serious consequences. I have no choice but to pursue justice. And that's the end of the quote, as well as the end of the article. And as if that wasn't all good enough, and we won't read this whole thing because I'll actually just recommend that you check out A.D. Robles' videos on the matter. He goes much more in depth than I do. However, the Gospel Coalition Canada says, what if we had 50 years before the outbreak of formal persecution in Canada in response to James Coates and the arrest of Pawlowski, right? Now, they don't specifically name some of those figures here, but nonetheless, we do know that this is in the response. Around the year AD 63, the Apostle Peter wrote a letter to some Christians living in northern Asia Minor who were beginning to experience the first headwinds of social and state persecution at the hands of the Romans. I'm actually surprised that the Gospel Coalition still affirms that Peter wrote that, considering the vast majority of secularists don't, but nonetheless. They were not yet being arrested, nor had the practice of their faith been criminalized, but they were facing legitimate discrimination. Now, of course, this is just historically hilarious. Obviously, there had been tons of formal persecution at the hands of both the Romans and the Jews as of this point. In fact, up until this point, we've already seen the arrest of Paul numerous times, including the final arrest that eventually leads to his execution, the execution of James, the execution of John the Baptist, the execution of Jesus himself, and so on and so forth. And in fact, if you listen to church tradition, which is obviously outside of the Bible, it is believed that Nicodemus was also executed in between this point in time. Also, in the 60s, virtually every single one of the surviving apostles was executed. In the 60s, Peter was executed. In the 60s, Jude was executed. Thomas was executed. Bartholomew was executed. Paul was executed. So on and so forth. All in the 60s, but it wasn't real persecution, according to the Gospel Coalition. And it's important to note this historical inaccuracy, but because they continue down here saying things like Christians have a tendency to see demons behind every bush. We have a tendency to exaggerate the opposition we are facing, right? And in other words, saying that the fact that pastors are being arrested for having the audacity to preach is apparently seeing demons behind every bush and having a tendency to exaggerate the opposition we're facing. The verse he uses in this particular situation, well, hang on, I want to get this quote. The only specific suffering noted is discrimination and mistreatment and verbal abuse from former colleagues and friends. That's wrong, right? This is Thomas R. Schreiner who says this. It's just incorrect. It's just outright false. Again, there's been executions at this point and torturings at this point. Paul has been stoned at this point. Paul's been beaten at this point. Paul's been arrested numerous times at this point, including the final time. Like, these people just don't know what they're talking about. And they're using that to chastise Christians who are sounding the alarm about Christian persecution occurring in the West. And they quote from Peter, "Who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good?" As if that somehow indicates that Peter was not actually responding to people who were being persecuted. In fact, Peter is specifically responding to people who are being persecuted. We know this because he says, "Let no man suffer as a criminal." He doesn't say the word criminal, but he lists a bunch of crimes, meaning don't suffer at the hands of the state for committing a crime. But if you suffer as a Christian, meaning if you suffer as a Christian at the hands of the state, consider it gain. That's what Peter says in this verse, or in this chapter in this book, where he's apparently talking about how Christians aren't really being persecuted and are only seeing demons behind these bushes everywhere they look. And these lies are what is being used to try and shut up people like myself, like James White, like James Coates, and others who are sounding the alarm on Christian persecution occurring here in the West. And then they just state an outright lie here. As it happened, there were, in fact, almost 50 years before the warning clouds of 1 Peter broke forth into an actual storm of formal persecution. In AD 112, the Emperor Trajan sent Pliny the Younger to investigate the growing community of Christians in Bithynia Pontus. There had been so many converts from paganism in the previous few decades that it actually began to affect the local economy. Pliny was thus commissioned to investigate the movement, and a number of Christians were arrested, examined by torture, and a significant number executed upon confession of the faith of Christ. And these people are saying there was almost 50 years before the warning clouds of 1 Peter broke forth into formal persecution. So let's ignore the fact that every single one of the apostles, sans Judas, who killed himself, and John, who lived at a ripe old age, literally was executed at the hands of the state. That Paul was executed at the hands of the state. That Mark and Luke were both executed at the hands of the state. That John the Baptist and Jesus were executed at the hands of the state. That Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were executed at the hands of the state. I mean, I can go on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Right? We have situations all over. Barnabas is said to have been executed by the state. Right? I mean, it's such a ridiculously absurd thing to say that Christians weren't persecuted until 112 AD. But then again, I need to point out they're using these lies, these outright lies, to then chastise people like, again, myself, who are trying to sit here and sound the alarm on legitimate Christian persecution that is absolutely occurring. And it's going to get worse. It doesn't stop with arresting Pastor Pulowski, right? We know that from not only these ancient times, but let's just take a very modern example. China didn't start by putting people in concentration camps. China didn't start by beating pastors in the middle of the street. China didn't start by, destroying churches and things like that. In fact, China started, if we take this back, China started by reaching out to the Catholic Church and trying to quote unquote make peace. Do you guys remember? We talk about it frequently, the 2018 Sino-Vatican Provisional Agreement. And this gospel coalition, quote unquote, is basically saying, this is a nothing burger, nothing to see here, move along, please. And again, I'd like to recommend that you go see A.D. Robles' videos on this matter, because he's going much more in depth than I do. I'm not going too in depth because it's already been 43 minutes, and I want to get into Israel, because Israel is obviously a very big deal here. But nonetheless, I do have the articles provided for you in the description as well. So there is that as well. So first, we're going to go updates on the Israeli elections, because there is a lot to be said. So Bennett and Lapid aim to swear in government by Thursday. This was on May 9th. This did not occur. However, there are certain important things, important aspects of this article that are still incredibly relevant that we've already hinted to in articles before. And that's why we're going to read some of it here today. In fact, you can already see it in the very first sentence here. Bennett made significant progress in a meeting with Ra'am, the United Arab List head Mansour Abbas, on Sunday. And he will meet with him again with Lapid on Monday. Now, Ra'am is not just an Arab political party. Ra'am is actually an Islamist political party. Hang on, sorry, there's a ad here. Yeah, an Islamist political party. So in other words, the Israeli government, the Netanyahu and ultra-Orthodox sides in the Israeli government are actively working with Islamists to try and form a government. That's going on right now. Okay. Again, we've talked about this a little bit before on some of last week's episode, but that is occurring right now. Right? That's a huge, huge, huge development. Let's continue. Negotiating teams of Yamina and Yesh Atid met with representatives of their potential coalition partners on Sunday in an effort to swear in a new government by the end of the week. Yamina Party Chairman Naftali Bennett and Yesh Atid Party leader Yair Lapid want the deal done this week because the Shavuot holiday is next Monday, and Bennett is under the intense pressure from the right to not give into Lapid. Posts on social media on Sunday displayed a death notice for Bennett, and a protest was held on Sunday night outside the Tel Aviv home of Bennett's number 2 in Yamina, MK Ayet Shaked. Coalition agreements must be submitted 24 hours ahead of a vote, so they would have to be completed by Wednesday to vote in the government on Thursday, which again did not happen. Bennett made significant progress in a meeting with the Ra'am Party, United Arab List, and their head Mansour Abbas on Sunday, and he will meet with him again with Lapid on Monday as negotiating teams will try to finalize a full coalition agreement with Ra'am. Abbas will not become a minister, but his party will be an official part of the coalition in return for several economic steps that help his Arab constituents. Quote, Mansour wants to vote in favor, not abstain, so we are trying to finalize the deal with him to get his votes, end quote, Yamina said. I guess we will probably... No, we're not going to read the whole thing, sorry. Anyways, Lapid will also meet on Monday with joint list leaders Ayman Odeh and Ahmad Tibi in an effort to persuade them to abstain in a vote on the new government. But Abbas wants full credit for whatever he delivers for the Arab sector and does not want to share it with his rivals. Teams from Labor, Meretz, Yisrael Betenyu, and Blue and White met with... excuse me, let me redo that. Teams from Labor, Meretz, Yisrael Betenyu, and Blue and White met the Yamina and Yesh Atid negotiators. Lapid made an effort to deny reports that Labor leader Merav Michaeli was asking for too much for her party, and derailing a new government. Michaeli is a central and very positive force in the establishment of a unity government and is working together with us responsibly in full coordination, end quote, Lapid wrote on Twitter. Quote, I am looking forward to working with her in the government, end quote. Sources working on the formation of the new government said it was more problematic that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was still trying to woo Yamina and prevent agreements from being reached. The sources saw a letter from United Torah Judaism NK's Meir Porish and Yisrael Eichler to Netanyahu on Sunday, urging him to enable someone else on the right to form a government as part of the maneuver. See if that ends up occurring. I personally doubt it. The UTJ MKs suggested that if someone else led the right, New Hope could join a coalition instead of enabling a government with Lapid. They expressed hope that additional elections could be avoided. And we'll sort of leave this particular article there because you get the idea, right? People are trying to say we might form coalitions if and only if Netanyahu is not the leader. And on the other side, people are saying we might form coalitions, but it's going to be a weird one, right? It's going to be Ra'am and United Torah Judaism and Likud. And so that's ultra-Orthodox Islamists and the establishment right wing all being in the same coalition government. That could be dangerous. That basically guarantees, if it occurs, that there will be discussion about the Old City, that there will be discussion about the Temple Mount, that there will be discussion about Jerusalem in general, that there will be discussion about Palestine, right? And it also, I think, definitely makes the way for Yehuda Glick, right? Israel's presidential election slated for June 2nd. My friends, it's May 14th. By the way, happy birthday, Israel, because it's the birthday of Israel today. It's May 14th. Do you know what that means? Right? Do the little knuckle thing. January, February, March, April, May, 31 days. So 31, subtract your 14, add your 2. What do you have? 19 days. That's all we got. That's all we got. And I know some of you probably already knew that, but I like to have fun with this. That is all we have got until the Israeli election. And will they end up electing Yehuda Glick? I don't know. We'll see. I personally suspect yes. I personally suspect that this whole, especially in light of the wars that are occurring, I think he's going to be seen as a peacemaker. But we'll see, right? We're very close to this event. And that, if he is elected, that will be history in the making. That will be something that will very... sorry, I just noticed this article's not going to let me read the whole thing unless I give him money. You're joking. Well, oh well. You guys get the idea, right? And by the way, it does say Isaac Herzog is seen as the likely front runner, but he has not officially declared any candidacy. So he might not even run to begin with. But yeah, June 2nd is when that is occurring. So are we going to get a fifth election? Likely. Also, June the 2nd is when we are going to see the president of Israel elected. And will that be Yehuda Glick? I don't know. But if it is, you best believe Temple Mount things are coming just right out the gate, right? But we'll see. We'll see. Let's get to some of the war before we end. That's the wrong thing. Before we end this here. I do see Honesty Angel is here, and also Slam. Shalom to both of you. By the way, for anybody who is here, I know we don't get as high of views on this one because it's a brand new channel, but please do like, please do share, please do consider subscribing if you have not done so. I'm trying to get these live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 a.m., but obviously that doesn't tend to work very well so far, but we're hoping, right? We might have some stuff in development here very soon. And also, if you think that I am deserving of it, you can, of course, support me on Patreon. I just dropped that in the live chat if anybody wants to check that out. If you feel led, of course. Let's get on to our last point. So violence in the Holy Land. Over 70 have been killed so far as Israel and Palestinians exchange their worst violence in years, mainly since 2014 in the Gaza war, and they prepare for more to come. In the worst flare-up of violence in 7 years, Israel launched hundreds of airstrikes and Palestinian militants fired hundreds of missiles so far this week. Interesting that it's 7 years, right? Killing more than 70 people and injuring hundreds more amid rising fears the conflict could spiral into all-out war, which it certainly has so far. What started as a week of tense clashes in Jerusalem escalated, and we actually reported on some of that in last week's episodes. What started as a week of tense clashes in Jerusalem escalated Wednesday into an aerial conflict and violent unrest on the streets of mixed Arab-Israeli towns. An Israeli nationalist mob was filmed late Wednesday attacking and beating an Arab man after he was dragged from his car in Bat Yam, Reuters reported. On Mark's Wednesday evening, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delivered a message to the citizens of Israel. I say, quote, I do not care if your blood is boiling. You cannot take the law into your own hands, end quote. Netanyahu said he would redeploy police and Israeli defense forces to mixed ethnicity cities. Shortly after midnight Thursday, air raid sirens blared across Tel Aviv. Palestinian militants have launched over 1,000 rockets into Israel since Sunday, and at least 2 high-rise buildings have been leveled in the Israeli bombardment of the blockaded and impoverished Gaza Strip, home to 2 million Palestinians. At least 65 people, including 16 children, were killed in the Israeli bombardment, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. And by the way, I do want to point out that though I absolutely feel for those children, and it is a horrible, horrible thing that is going on, we need to understand something, right? Which is that this is Israeli land and that Arabs are invaders, okay? They are living there by the good graces of the Israeli government, and they still are being violent about it anyways. Okay? I'm not saying that means that these children deserve to die. What I am saying, though, is that, we see these articles often painting Israel as the aggressor. Not only are they not the aggressor, it's their land. But anyways. Bassam Issa, the commander for Gaza City, was also among the dead. Hamas's military wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, confirmed. Staff Sergeant Omar Tabib of the Israeli Defense Force, was also killed. 6 Israelis were killed in the coastal cities of Ashkelon and Rishon LeZion, however you say that, LeZion probably, in the city of Lod, southeast of Tel Aviv and near the Gaza border. Officials said. In total, more than 200 people have been wounded in Israel, and there have been more than 300 Palestinians injured, according to authorities on both sides. So we're at roughly 70 dead, 500 wounded, according to this article. I think it has escalated since this article, but nonetheless. In the most intense exchange of fire since the 2014 war in Gaza, both sides appear to be preparing for more violence. Quote, we're escalating towards a full-scale war, end quote, Tor Wennesland, the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, said in a tweet, quote, stop the fire immediately. And this is his full tweet. He says, stop the fire immediately. We're escalating towards a full-scale war. Leaders on all sides have to take the responsibility of de-escalation. The cost of war in Gaza is devastating and is being paid by ordinary people. UN is working with all sides to restore calm, stop the violence now. And of course, while I agree that we should obviously pray for the violence to be stopped, I certainly don't want the United Nations involved in anything. And I think they might be trying to use this as an opportunity to further their agenda. But that's just my own cynicism speaking, I guess. U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price told a briefing Tuesday, quote, Israel has the right to defend itself, end quote. And, quote, the Palestinian people also have the right to safety and security just as the Israelis do, end quote. The United States is speaking with both sides, quote, to urge calm, de-escalation, and restraint on both sides, end quote. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas received a letter from President Joe Biden on Tuesday regarding the conflict, according to the official Palestinian news agency WAFA. Quote, Israeli security forces must exercise maximum restraint and calibrate their use their use of force, end quote, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in a statement. The indiscriminate launching of rockets and mortars towards Israeli population centers is unacceptable, end quote. And I do think that the UN and the US is going to Shalom, friends. Sorry about that. internet kind of cut out here for a little bit, so I apologize. I'm not really sure where I was when I cut off. But nonetheless, we were talking here in this article, and I was saying how I think that the U.S. and the UN are going to use this as an opportunity to split Jerusalem three ways, with the Old City, the West Jerusalem going to, the Old City being internationalized, West Jerusalem going to Israel, and East Jerusalem going to Palestine. I don't know if that'll happen immediately, but I think there are a lot of things coming into play, such as Islamists and ultra-Orthodox and typical right-wing being linked with each other in Israel. Also, we're having, people who are wanting Yehuda Glick to be president, potentially June 2nd. That's something else I would think of that is kind of leading towards all this, and et cetera, et cetera. So the point just kind of being that I think that this is something that we should watch out for. I think that this is something that we absolutely are not ready for. And I think we're going to have some pretty intense things going on here. I wanted to briefly mention, because I do think this is probably a good time to stop, Erdogan from Turkey is saying that the UN must act to halt the Gaza conflict. He's also said that he wants to try and send troops to Jerusalem himself. Israel has also attacked the Gaza Strip as of today, as far as a full-fledged attack. So we are at this point in time actually in war as far as Israel is concerned. They are in war, I should say, because it's not the United States' war. And that does bring me to a concluding thought I do want to say, which is that I do firmly support nationalism and as a result firmly support Zionism. I believe that the Arabs are aggressors and invaders. I also believe that this is none of our business. Not in the news sense. Obviously, it's a lot of our business in the news sense, and it's going to be something that has a lot of sway on our lives, unfortunately. But from a strictly political standpoint, I do believe that foreign aid gets us into a lot of trouble. I believe in the case of the nations that we aid, it essentially turns them into client states that don't have any real sovereignty. They have to ask us whether or not they can or cannot do something. And for us, it gets us involved in conflicts that we have no business being in, as well as spending a bunch of taxpayer money. So wanted to briefly mention that as well. But nonetheless, if you guys like this video, please do like, please do share, please consider subscribing. I apologize for any fogginess or anything like that. Again, I am kind of sick, so, whatever with that, I guess. But questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, anything like that in the comment section below. Please consider, again, liking, sharing, and subscribing. What good is a message without an audience to hear it, as I often say. And if you feel led, you can obviously support me on Patreon. I appreciate anybody who does so. Before I go, just want to ask you, in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise?